Okay, so if you go ahead and look at group one's breakout, for this first question that we discussed was how can we leverage conventional funding mechanisms such as donations, grants, and subsidies, or sorry, subsidies. The topics of discussion were R&D grant programs, this idea of taxic and basic common income for biodiversity. We also touched on green bonds and voluntary opt-in and opt-out taxes in that same discussion. We also took a look at locally governed funding pools for TSPs for monitoring, planning, and locally qualified practices. And also considering corporate supply chains and premium pricing claims. And to move on to the next question that we discussed was, should external funding stop after onboarding? How long should funding continue? This was a very interesting topic of discussion. So in that discussion, we've understood that data collection is a public good, and that one of the ways that we could go about getting data collection is by establishing fellowships with universities, just so that we're able to use regionally specific individuals and send them out to collect data in certain regions. And that with incremental funding, it brings this idea of participation-based funding and catalytic or seed funding for onboarding processes. And that with that being said, also equitable progressive funding streams. And then another topic of discussion was how can we create thriving markets around new and novel credit-based methodologies? And that could be done by developing ways that organizations and people can articulate regenerative practices are, and building them a portfolio to match. And while we were also discussing this, we were also talking about how individuals in those spaces that belong to groups that are concerned about the health of water quality can have a voice to explain that they care about certain practices or projects. And yeah, so that was a brief overview of what we talked about. Anyone from the group is welcome to summarize or mention any points that I failed to mention or cover.
Oh, yeah, I felt like some of our interesting conversations were kind of on the behavioral level of thinking about like defaults and how defaults are used and like opt-in and opt-out systems, such like how are those mechanics already at play within different funding structures, and like are they relevant or not, or what are the ethics behind those? So yeah, just to add that, I felt like the kind of almost the behavioral economic question of defaults and like subscriptions and those processes. What are the ethics of those?
Yeah, maybe we can also add that we were like discussing about this endowment and how to form the funds.
Any questions from the group, from the broader group? All right, let's go to group two.
I'll be reporting for group two. I'm going to break them actually into themes instead of focusing on each individual question. I felt like we flowed pretty well just in and around questions as we were discussing them. And the theme really is distill. So we talked a lot about all the complexities to all these questions that we were being asked. And so we talked about things like storytelling is important about the climate future or climate solutions. We went into some discussions about, video assets as being important. the need to engage, and this kind of went to the equity question. So how do you get more people understanding and involved? And that really has to do with the narrative. Where do they fit in the narrative? One of the things we talked about is TurboTax software. It basically asks you questions about your life for the past year, and while it does that, it just does your taxes. So that should be a similar experience in order to get more people engaged. We had a discussion on fear of missing out as another theme. So there's meme coins and all this fun stuff going on in the crypto space. But why can't that be the same for climate and for things that have value? So marketing, having fun, using social media is important. So then I'll go back to this theme of traditional tools. So kind of the old tools. We talked about how can underwriters at banks use regenerative practices in their underwriting. So for example, the Environmental Defense Fund just signed a deal with Farmers Business Network. And so they're going to be saying, you can qualify for certain loans that are going to be cheaper because you're doing regenerative practices. So that's just an insight, I think, into the future. I think it's going to happen more frequently. We talked about microfinancing in Brazil and the importance of that. So that kind of, I think, is in the gray area between traditional and new tools. Microfinancing has been around for a while. We talked about peer-to-peer networks, the idea that a group of farmers might be able to come together, or individual, but they could lend to each other. That would be interesting. We talked about potentially donor-advised funds and institutional investing as still viable tools that can help push things forward. And then we talked about new tools. So there's a huge long list: quadratic funding and voting mechanisms, new crowdsourcing mechanisms, allocation engines, automated distribution, and non-token-based funding. We looked at what Open Team is doing, making community decision-making on grants and other funding. So making, the future is having the community decide where the money goes. And then we talked about this concept of digital intermediaries. So because of this complexity that I talked about in telling a story, people need help. Farmers don't know and don't have the time really to learn all these tools. I mean, it gets complicated every year. So how do we handhold them? How do we get them to participate, but not erect barriers because of the technical solutions? So one of the things we talked about was needing more visualizations. And I threw an example of like no code tools. They're exploding everywhere where you can build anything. You don't need to know code. So how do we do that in this space? How do we reduce the complexity? And I think that covered the basis. We talked a little bit about Project Drawdown and the Regen Network, got into some more specifics. But anybody else from our group can also chime in if there's something I missed.
Any general questions from the group? The big group?
Blake, what do you think would be some of the best things to do quadratic voting around?
I don't know. We didn't really get into that in detail. I don't know if maybe from my group had an opinion. Does anybody in the broader group have some thoughts around that?
So I, having participated in the Gitcoin round and following what Kevin and those guys are doing, I think for DAOs, right, or DAOs of DAOs, quadratic funding is super interesting because groups can come together and all have different interests, but then they have a say in where the greater funds are going. But it's not biased either. It's not, a whale isn't controlling all of it. It's like one thing we've talked about, there's a refi DAO that's forming on Twitter, and basically the individuals are members and then organizations are partners. and the partners don't outweigh the members, and quadratic funding starts to actually work in that situation, because the more individual members you have, right, it starts to steer the greater portions of funding that way. So that's an example.
So you say that in the big organizations, the quadratic voting won't work, like when in the big communities?
I think it works when you have more votes. I think technically quadratic voting is like you have to have more votes to then steer more funds
Yeah,
that
exactly.
way.
exactly.
It's
So
it's not based on the amount of the amount of funding, or the it's like it spreads it out.
For the size of the community, that's why I probably didn't understand you before. I was a little bit confused. Yeah, I mean, for the quadratic voting in general, it's good for like this kind of a swarm populations. However, let's say if you have more like an organizational style funds, so small funds, or controlled by represented by an entity, yes, then we probably want like more traditional mechanisms.
Yeah, I wonder if a like a farmer cooperative structure would benefit from something like that. If it was a large group, large enough group of farmers, I could see that maybe being an implementation.
All right, can we move to group 3?
Sure, yeah, I'll be reporting on group 3. So we started out with a big picture question of why are we discussing funding, or what is funding for? And we talked through kind of all different factors, to the cost of monitoring, to transition costs from conventional to regenerative, or maybe people are already doing regenerative activity but not getting paid for it yet, or maybe the value of their land is going down, or its fertility is going down, because they're currently using degrading practices. And then we transitioned into some discussion around education. And I think education, we can probably use that term to describe a lot of things here. Education around regenerative agriculture, around payments for ecosystem services, around Web3. There's kind of a lot of ways to be engaging people. We were discussing kind of what maybe you call them on ramps and off ramps or something like that. Like we discussed, in some cases, farmers are just going to want to use the cash that's accepted as local currency in their country. In other cases, they might be unbanked to begin with and be like Web3 native, and working with some kind of alternative local currency that's Web3, or maybe they're DeFi savvy and are fine with kind of current stable coins that are available. But just this question of how to farmers actually get capital that they can spend and use to capitalize regenerative agriculture. And then we also were discussing how sometimes stable coins are illegal, that sometimes if a country has capital controls or other things like that, we might be breaking their laws if we're coming in with other currencies. We discussed that certainly farmers are excited about practice-based credits, but what's kind of buyers' reception to them? And also we discussed the kind of substantial risk that anyone is taking on in anticipating the value of future credits. We talked about the relationship between practice and outcome-based credits, that practice are essentially paying people up front, and outcome are we're saying you've already done this, and the idea that there's a relationship between practices and outcomes. But one of the things we were discussing is in 5 or 10 years, when a project is having yields in outcomes, what if there's a global carbon standard and the project that you invested in doesn't meet that standard? So we were talking about ways to kind of look at the bundle of value in a project. Who knows, maybe the kind of social credits produced through a project end up being the most valuable credits available in 10 years, and it has nothing to do with carbon. So just wondering how to kind of the bundle of value that's tied up in a land base and set of practices and things like that, and how it might be repackaged down the road based on what's actually valuable at that time. You talked about tax treatment and kind of cost basis and long-term capital gains, and certainly it would be much more advantageous for the farmers if they were holding a long-term asset that appreciated in value, rather than them just getting revenues in ecosystem services and having to pay income tax on that. I'm sure tax strategy will vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but that's definitely one factor to consider. And then the one of the final things we were discussing is just would we want to be working in regulated markets, like registering to sell futures, so that way we'd be able to work with institutional capital providers, and also just discussing maybe the kind of centralization of those approaches has to do with the lack of creativity of the lawyers who've built them, as opposed to the laws themselves. And yeah, I'll pause there.
I want to add to that, Will, and say that one other kind of bigger thought that was amidst all of this was about how all of the multi-dimensionality to all of this. So the spectrum of practices, the spectrum of buyers, the different ways that people can interact and participate, the different funding mechanisms that would work. And it seems like a framework with the lens of funding will need to have options. There needs to be some flexibility to account for everyone's different needs coming to the table, depending on how literate or illiterate someone might be with Web3, especially at first needing to kind of have more of a menued approach.
I'd like to echo that as well. That's one of the main things that stood out for me was the menu approach, having options for both the buyers and the producers, because what may have value for some organizations or businesses or certain regions may not be valuable to others. And one other thing I'd love to highlight here is Timo, he mentioned, how do we change the narrative? How do we make regenerative agriculture just agriculture? How do we make regenerative finance just finance? How do we make the fringe, which may be Web3 or blockchain, more mainstream? And I think Blake answered that question very well about the storytelling. So I think that how do we create these narratives, these stories, is going to be very important to help educate and transform into new economies, so regenerative economies.
Yeah, and to echo that point, Ishmael, I feel like we're creating the narrative, right? Like we can interview buyers and we can interview suppliers, but then we can also like steer the narrative and help create pricing and create markets for this stuff. So like education and storytelling to me is like a huge component of this, and how we distill the message down to a very simple, non-jargony form.
All right, let's move on to group 4, the last group.
I guess I'll start with the one that had the most discussion, which was how can we create thriving markets around credits. I think one of the interesting things we talked about was getting non-traditional buyers in these markets, like people who are just interested in offsetting their emissions. And one thing that came up was kind of using games to do that, perhaps using blockchain-based games that can allow you to retire credits to produce some sort of outcome or increase some sort of stat in your game to kind of incentivize non-traditional actors in the space. And then moving on to some of the other stuff was options to integrate fiat currency into these projects. We talked about problems that can occur, like do projects really want crypto-based tokens? Is that going to be like a burden for them to have to continue swapping back and forth? Maybe they need fiat currency immediately and they don't want to be holding on to assets like tokens that could appreciate in value. And then we talked about grants. And we talked a lot about USDA and how there's a lot of money that can be put towards projects, but how the organization is a little messy and it can kind of be complex to navigate and get funding into your project. Whereas smart contracts and DAOs can kind of provide more direct funding and less friction for projects. One we talked about was, I think Will brought it up, was Angel Protocol on Terra, which is, I think, a public good funding mechanism. I think that's mostly the gist of our discussion. I don't know if other group members want to add on. I probably missed a few things. Oh, we can't hear you, Ryan.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
One thing that came up that I thought was really interesting was like how practice-based methodologies were potentially more like they could have more benefit within like a local kind of setting, where a lot of there's like land trust community land trust projects popping up and DAOs that could represent local communities, and how practice-based methodologies could be ways to kind of build local communities, whereas like carbon markets in general are kind of more on the global level. And there's a lot of opportunity with practice-based methodologies to be like to funnel funds back into local communities. And one idea was like having infrastructure builders needing to buy practice-based credits in order to build, and essentially like finding ways to kind of maybe collaborate with land trust community projects in ways, and having that localized focus in terms of taking on problems with the practice-based methodologies as a solution was just something that I think we discussed for a little while, and I thought that was really interesting, just because we were trying to, with these practice-based methodologies, we're trying to move away from the focus on carbon, and having kind of like a knowledge sharing platform where everyone could share the practice-based methodologies they've implemented in their local communities and how it's benefiting their local communities. And people could take those practices and implement them in other local communities, but kind of switching the focus, having carbon being so focused on global efforts and having practice-based methodologies being more focused on local communities would be an interesting approach, or something to further think about that resonated with me a lot in the conversation.
Ryan, I think what's really powerful about that path is that it leads to an empowering and building of capacity to form DAOs around that knowledge sharing, that bioregional connection being made. That's awesome.
All right, any other thoughts from that group or from the larger group before we wind down? All right, so for tomorrow, tomorrow we'll address two components, the methodology development and legitimacy. So what we'll do is we'll break out into breakout groups, probably 2 breakout groups per component. We'll just see how many people are there and what your interests are, which group you want to participate in. Then Friday, we'll work with the data collection and storage, and also verification. Those will be the 2 components that are covered on Friday. So again, if you know people that might be interested or have expertise in any of these areas, certainly invite them to join us, and I hope you folks come back. And if you have comments or criticisms about this process or what's going on, feel free to get in touch with us and let us know. Anybody on the science team at Regen would be able to field your questions. So are there any questions or comments before we cut off in a minute or two?
I have a comment, and I'm sorry I missed the breakout rooms, but Blake and Hope and I are all colleagues working on a Regen funded project. And the first work stream of that is around use cases. And so we're really looking for all and any projects that we can apply a framework to. And, you know, I'm so excited because hearing some of the things on this call, like one of the elements of the use case will be looking around like language, you know, defining what's the core concept, what's the background for where this use case kind of fits, what concepts are they testing, sort of what assumptions they have in place, how do you test these assumptions, sort of what opportunities are they going after and what market they fit in. So if anyone's working on those use cases, please get in touch with us because we're going to be capturing that in an Airtable, kind of delivering it as part of this grant.
All right, anything else? All right, well, same place, same time tomorrow. Hopefully I'll see everybody. All right, take care.
Thank
All
you.
right, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.